It's interesting that the scriptures that we read outline very clearly not only the grace of the Lord and the beauty of His creation, but outline very carefully and describe very carefully the fallenness of this world. When our text starts out by saying, when you wage war. Yeah. And there was and has been destruction ever since the fall of man in the garden. It starts with a murder of a brother, and it continues on. Why is that? If the evolutionists were even half clearly right, or let's say 1/100th of 1% right, which they're not, we would have to come to the conclusion that eventually we would progress to the point where we would no longer need war. Where war would be obliterated, right? I mean, we wouldn't have it anymore.
They believe that, though.
Well, no one's ever told me that they believe that. Evolution is based upon survival of the fittest.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't conflict themselves.
Well, they're conflicted the first time they say that they're an evolutionist, but at any rate. And why is that? You say, well, Tim, are you just on a rampage against evolution? No, not really. The scriptures teach us that built within each one of us as created beings is a sense of God's existence. For everything that is in the created world proves that there is, and they're without excuse who say that there's no creator, right? How can they be without excuse if they haven't been given the truth? They say, well, they haven't read the Bible. They don't have to read the Bible. They can look at the creation. The invisible things of God are known by those things which are created, even His eternal Godhead. According to Paul in chapter 1 of Romans, is the Bible right? So there's a sense in which every atheist is lying to himself or herself. No one will be able to stand before God and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. There was no way for me to know. This is why it's so important for us to recognize the first 2 chapters of Genesis as foundational for our faith. Now, I know there's all kinds of different approaches. There are people who are truly believers in the Lord who hold some form of so-called theistic evolution. But the reality is that our world is not getting better and better. I remember the first time my dad, when I was talking about first buying a car, of course I didn't have any money. I was in high school, but I was saving my money, and I ended up buying for $200 an old Chevy that needed a lot of work. But at any rate, I thought to myself, why not buy a new car? And my father said, as soon as you drive it off the lot, you will have lost thousands of dollars. Why? Shouldn't it get better and better? Shouldn't everything just get better and better? You say, well, Tim, this is kind of a pessimistic way of looking at life. No, I hope it's not pessimistic. I hope it's realistic. Ultimately, in a time when Yeshua has returned and the old heavens and earth have been done away with and the new heavens and earth have been created, there will be no sin in that new heaven and that new earth. And things will be the way God intends them to be. It's hard for us to even envision that or to consider it, isn't it? There's some things about the way our system works in this fallen world that we enjoy. I've thought to myself, what will eternity be without babies? Babies are a great joy. We see that little toddler starting to walk. Are we going to grow up in eternity? Are we going to get older? Will there be babies? I don't know. God hasn't told us. But I know this for sure. It will be everything God intends it to be. And that means there will be nothing in it that will be contrary to His person, to His being. Death will be no more. However He's going to do that, I don't know. But if He could speak and the universe came into existence, then most certainly He can make an eternity in which there will be no end. So here we are on a day where we're kind of looking back and with some sadness and sorrow. The destruction that happened at 70 in the destruction of the temple. We don't, I think, understand the immensity of what took place there. The terribleness that took place in the much more recent Holocaust, and the lives that were taken and slaughtered. And we look at our world around us and we say, can we really be joyful? No, I'm not teaching a lesson today of morbidity, of just saying, oh, woe is us, we have nothing good. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that in this world of fallenness, God has given us something that cannot be taken away. And that is a solid and sure hope in who we are in the Messiah, Yeshua. And there is coming a day when He will return and He will take us unto Himself, and we will forever be with the Lord. And what do the Scriptures say about that phrase? Therefore, comfort one another with these words. In the midst of fallenness, there is joy. There is deep-seated reality in the truth of who God is and what Yeshua has done for us. And if we can know anything for certain, we can know that. Because there's as much or more evidence for Yeshua's death and resurrection and His ascension on high. And the book that we have, which we know as the Bible, there's more evidence for its reality than really any other piece of literature in human history. If we can know anything by evidence, we know this for sure. God has sent His Son. He has died for those who would be saved. He rose again on the third day, just as He said. He showed Himself alive to hundreds of people, some of whom who wrote it down and gave us the record. And He ascended on high, and He said that He would return and take us unto Himself. So while we rightly consider the mistakes that are made, even in our own personal life, on Tisha B'Av, we look back and say, we were punished because, as a nation, we were so rebellious against God. But we can bring it down to a personal level. What is it that is in my life that needs to change? What is there in my life that the Lord wants done away with? What must I pick back up that I dropped and shouldn't have? How is my prayer life? How is my growing in understanding who God is and who I am in Him? These are the kinds of things that come to us on a day like today. So, as Israel prepared herself to enter the land in this fallen world and wage war against the inhabitants, God prescribes laws for proper battle. Isn't that interesting? This is clearly at the odds with the perspective of many other cultures, ancient and modern, which essentially teach that all moral and ethical standards are suspended in the arena of battle, right? All is fair in love and war. That's not true. All is not fair. God gave rules. For Israel, however, clear standards of ethics were prescribed by God through Moses for engagement in battle against their enemies. It is, in fact, the influence of the Torah upon the modern nations, which have been founded upon a Judeo-Christian ethic, that has established rules of engagement in our modern times. Those of you in the military, you know this well. Even in the midst of war, we are to remember that life is precious and that there are always innocent victims of war. Even in war, there is rules of ethics. In stark contrast to the lack of any adherence to ethics in war that clearly characterizes modern-day Islamic terrorist regimes, The same inhumane perspective fueled by the Nazi regime of World War II. While we may at times wonder about military courts that convene to judge the ethical behavior of our soldiers in the midst of battle, the very presence of such courts distinguishes civilized nations from those which remain barbaric. And it is the foundational teaching of the Torah that has established this difference. If you read about war in the ancient Near East, you know that there were no rules. One of the things in the ancient Near East that was common, especially of the Assyrians, as well as the Babylonians, is that they won many conflicts by fear. They would so brutalize the villages that they took over, that they conquered. And they would make their brutalization so well known in advance that other villages would simply pack up and leave. That's a society that has not been touched by the revelation of who God is and as creator of mankind in his image. Nobody likes war, or at least nobody should. Nobody likes the devastation of war, and in a fallen world there is war. And God recognizes this, and he, in our Torah portion, says, there's still, even in the worst of times in human existence, there are rules. There is ethics. We must remain who we are, created in the image of God, even when we must fight others. In the opening of Parashah, the rules for attacking a city outside of the land are given. Essentially, when Israel's armies approach a city that is far off, they were to first offer the city peace. If the city accepted the offer, the people could become the servants of Israel and were afforded the rights prescribed by the Torah for a slave or servant. If they refused the offer of peace and battle ensued, all of the men, those that could form a potential armed rebellion in the future, were to be executed, but the women and children were to be spared. Likewise, the cattle and goods of the city were to be taken as the spoils of war. A different injunction is given, however, for the fortified cities that were in the land itself, those which were near. These Canaanite cities were not to be afforded a peaceable surrender, but were to be utterly destroyed and no person left alive. You know, this is one text that I've had people bring it to me and say, look, the God that you worship is a monster. Well, when we read this, we gasp a little bit of air, don't we? We go, but think about the flood. Out of all of the populations on earth, 8 were saved. At whose hand did that come about? Again, one thing that we learn from this passage is the God that we serve and the God that we worship is a holy, righteous God. And he, as we say in our liturgy, which is a quote directly from Genesis 14, I believe, he is the owner of everything. I've told the story again, but it is an illustration. My roommate in college, who was and is an excellent artist, made a wonderful, nice drawing of Beethoven, and it was exquisite. He gave it to someone, and that someone didn't like it and gave it back. And when I came into the room, he was tearing it to pieces. I said, Ron, I wanted that. He looked at me with straight face and said, I made it. I can do with it as I wish. The Creator has the right to do with his creation according to his purposes. And it reminds us that he is a holy God whose wrath comes against unrighteousness. And we see this best where? In the cross. His own Son given to pay the penalty for our sin. So these Canaanite cities were not to be afforded a peaceable surrender, but were to be utterly destroyed and no person left alive. Our text lists 6 nations, while Deuteronomy 7 adds a 7th, the Girgashites. The primary, and it may well be that the 6 that are in our text included the Girgashites as part of that nation. The primary reason given for the destruction of these nations is that their demonic religions would inevitably influence Israel to disregard God and follow in their abominable practices. So much for coexist, I guess. If God is the director, then he has the right to do as he wishes. History proved this to be a reality. Our text in verse 18 speaks of the abhorrent things that they have done for their gods, Deut. Often this phrase refers to child sacrifice and occultist practices. It should be noted that it is the abhorrent practices that call for such extreme measures against the Canaanite cities, not merely stated beliefs. I hope it would never come to this, but I wonder what would happen in our nation if people decided some devilish, occultish religion began to sacrifice children. Do you think our nation would stand for it? Yes, the first step is abortion. When we take the life of an unborn child and do so with impunity, it opens the door to the worst of things. Now, I'm not saying that this would come to it, but I'm saying that life is sacred and it ought to be maintained as sacred. And in the erosion of our own nation's mores, we're on a very dangerous path. The sages themselves, the rabbis, struggled with the extreme measures prescribed against the cities of the land. They understood our Parashah and parallel texts to still hold a conditionality. According to some of the sages, if the Canaanite cities were willing to submit to the Noahide laws, they were to be spared. The Noahide laws don't even show up until much, 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 much later. It is understandable why teachers and scholars throughout the ages have struggled with the divine command to entirely wipe out all living persons in a city. This goes contrary to our own sense of fairness and the high sanctity for life prescribed everywhere in the Torah. Yet the text is quite clear, and no manner of explanation contrary to its clear meaning can be derived from it. What does this tell us about God and tell us about ourselves? First, it makes a very strong statement about God's hatred for idolatry and all of the things it brings with it. Idolatry is thus entirely contrary to God's plan for his people and fully thwarts the Almighty's intentions for how his chosen people should live. Secondly, it seems reasonable to conclude that in some cases, idolatry becomes so ingrained in a culture that the only way to rid oneself of that idolatry is to entirely forsake it or have no contact with it. Such leads to a third application. God knows that to whatever extent we allow an idolatrous culture to become our culture, to that extent we will succumb to idolatry itself. You think, well, that could never happen. Idolatry takes all kinds of forms, okay? Idolatry is when we give our life, energy, and concerns and honor to that which is other than God. We fool ourselves if we think that we can make certain aspects of pagan culture our own and not have it affect our souls. Now, don't get me wrong. Throughout the history of the world, there have been those who have lived in very pagan, idolatrous cultures who shone as lights in the midst of it and did not give in to it. So just because we live in a culture doesn't mean it has to pull us into its ideas and its beliefs. We only need to pause and consider the outcome of Israel's history to see how this works. In the conquest of the land, Israel did not follow the commands of our text. She allowed many of the pagan nations to remain and even intermarried with them. As a result, they became a snare to Israel and led her into a mixing of pagan worship with that prescribed for her by God. And the result of this mixing was her final demise from the land and her exile into the lands of her enemies, which is exactly what we remember on this day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. But there is more in our text which reveals the true nature of God. He not only hates idolatry, but he also loves justice. Even in the terrible events of war, he intends that his people act with justice and sincerity. It was common in the ancient times for invading armies to entirely destroy the lands they conquered. Often this came as a result of cutting the trees, salting the fields, and fouling the wells. As a result, after the invasion was complete, the land was worthless and would go for centuries before, by natural cycles, the pollution of the invasion was neutralized and the land was once again able to support life. They would plow salt into all of the fields. If you're a farmer and you know what happens when there's all kinds of salt in your ground, it doesn't work well for planting crops. Hashem's instructions to Israel, however, included something as insignificant, so to speak, as not cutting the food-bearing trees as they besieged a city. The tree was not to be put on the same level as an enemy warrior. It had been created by God to sustain life and was therefore to be cared for even in the heat of war and battle. This is because there is a clear attachment of God's purpose to the land. It is His land, and He intends for His vassal, His king, which is Israel, to take care of it for Him. This then gives us yet another glimpse of the God we serve and worship. He cares for physical realities as worthy of His great concern and guardianship. What a contrast. Trees are to be preserved, but the people who tended them are destroyed. What do we learn from this? That trees are more important than people? Some would say yes in our day. But that's not what we learn in the Scriptures. What we learn is God's intolerance of idolatry is absolute. Isn't it a bit fearsome? Be honest. To consider God's holiness. The only way that we can appreciate and even worship God in His holiness is to know for certain that all of His holiness has been satisfied by the death of His Son for us. It doesn't mean in any way that we then give into anything that we want. No. It's when we come to recognize how He has loved us, to what great extent He has loved us by giving us His Son, that we begin to hate sin that way He does. We don't hate sinners. We must not. We have the message of the gospel. We have the message of hope. God has given us a great opportunity to share His love and mercy with people everywhere. And it's the more that we come to recognize this, that we recognize what a great salvation we have. The tree was created for mankind to give him food, but mankind was created for God to give Him glory. As long as the tree performs its creative task, it is worthy and should be allowed to remain. But when man has turned from his creative purpose and rather worships the creature rather than the Creator, God gives them up to their own devices and their inevitable demise, according to Romans chapter 1. Oh, brothers and sisters, this is a very, very unpopular message, isn't it? In our times. Our culture would want us to receive everyone as they are, without thinking that there needs to be any changes, right? Well, we must receive them as created in the image of God, all of us, having therefore an equality. But we have the message of the truth, of the gospel in Yeshua, and we must be willing to live it and to speak it, that others might know. This attribute of justice is found emphasized once again in the part of our text which describes the procedure of dealing with a homicide in which the murderer is not found. Here there is need to make a clear declaration of innocence. Those elders of the city closest to the place where the corpse is found must undergo a ritual in which the blood of a sacrificial animal, slain in the field as the victim was, is shed in the field, and the elders of the city wash their hands over the slain heifer. This is no doubt symbolic of the confession that the elders have nothing to do at all with the slaying of the person, and that they, as the representatives of the city, maintain the innocence of the city in regard to the murder. It must also emphasize the fact that they have no knowledge of the murder or of the one who committed the crime. Thus, though the murder cannot be avenged through justice of the court, the city itself confesses innocence to the whole matter. There's a principle that we find here from the Scriptures. It's a principle that we probably could never fully implement, but we should strive to do so, and it is that the elders of a city ought to be trustworthy. If the elders of the city are themselves complacent, in the murder, then they can't be trusted when they go out and say, we know nothing about it. How do we elect officials and know that they're trustworthy? That's a tough one, isn't it? That is a tough one. Because we know that old adage that authority corrupts and ultimate authority ultimately corrupts. There is, hopefully there are some checks and balances, even in our own governmental system, that we're able to find those who are trustworthy to be judges in our culture, in our cities, and so forth. Did I see a hand? And where does that all begin? Where does that mentality begin? It begins with the mentality that the Bible is not the primary source of knowing God.
It's just one way among many.
Yeah. As soon as we give up on the Scriptures, we really have nothing to stand upon, right? Then it becomes whatever this person, that person, or whomever has decided. So what is the point? Murder, the taking of an innocent life, simply cannot go unattended or without due process, at least to the extent possible. We may therefore reason that whenever a society begins to look upon murder as something acceptable, that society has given up the standard of justice which the Lord Himself reveals. In this regard, we should consider our society's views of abortion, the murder of innocent children, and the manner in which this is considered not only acceptable, but the sure right of every woman or man. The same may be said of the move toward euthanasia. And we see the consequences of this acceptance of murder, the devaluation of life itself, so that violence continues to rise and random taking of life is viewed by a new generation of Americans as almost something that is expected. Once again, it is the message of who God is and His gracious teaching, the Torah, which leads us in the life He has designated for us. Such a life is both to His glory and to our happiness. The Haftarah was chosen by the rabbis to accompany our Torah text because it focuses upon the history of the conquest and the victories God gave to Israel over the inhabitants of the land. It also includes Joshua's exhortation to entirely turn away from anything that is connected to idolatry and to serve the Lord with wholeness of heart. His declaration at the end of our Haftarah is a model for every head of household. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The apostolic portion also emphasizes the wholehearted devotion to God that should characterize all of us who have been redeemed by God's grace. And let me say this, I don't think any, as Paul said, I have not yet arrived. I'm not yet complete. We're all of us in this journey of becoming more and more what God intends us to be. Don't you agree? So I'm not saying, well, there's a standard you have reached and now you're there and boy, way to go. Now you can relax. No, I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm saying that in each of our lives, God intends us to become more and more conformed to the image of His Son. Why is it that the world, the ungodly ways of rebellious mankind, continue to attract the attention of God's children? Why would John have to exhort us not to love the world? The answer is that remaining in us all is the sinful nature that is a friend to the world. Only through God's grace and the strength of His Spirit are we enabled to put to death the deeds of the flesh and live lives set apart to Him. But we must actively engage in this battle. You cannot rely and relax. You must rely and you must fight. You must rely and you must be diligent. You must rely and you must wrestle. We must learn to submit to the Spirit and to resist the evil one. We must make it our habit to say yes to God and to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. The ability to do this, to say no to what God hates and to say yes to what He loves, is the privilege of all who are born again by His Spirit and who have been forgiven of all their sins. It is in fact the love of God, learned by the heart of the one who has been rescued, that produces the desire to say yes to Him. We love Him. We love, and some of the texts say Him, but most of them just say, we love. We have the capacity to love as God intends because He first loved us. The more we realize what God has done for us through His Son, Yeshua, the more we are motivated to love Him by obeying Him and sanctifying His name in every way, as we read in 2 Corinthians 8:9. For you know the grace of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich.